Karen thought she was slick, used my lake cabin's address to file fake tax returns, probably trying to game the system. She had no clue the place belonged to a federal agent. So when the flags popped up and the investigation started, guess who showed up at her door? Let's just say the panic set in fast because messing with the IRS is one thing, but messing with someone who enforces it, that's a whole different story. When I first bought the lake cabin, it wasn't because I needed another property. I already had a decent apartment near the city, close to the federal agency office where I worked. But the lake, that quiet ripple of stillness surrounded by towering pines, was something else entirely. It was peace, the kind you can't replicate with white noise machines or vacations. It was a place where I didn't have to be a badge or a title. Just a man with a cast iron skillet, a rod and reel, and enough silence to finally hear himself think. The cabin wasn't flashy. One floor, aged cedar siding, and a front porch built for stargazing. I inherited it from a relative who knew I'd take care of it. A tight cluster of properties ringed the lake, a patchwork of rustic cabins, newer builds, and lots owned by out-of-towners. For the first few years, it was quiet. The nearest town was 15 minutes out, and I was fine with that. Even when the HOA formed, a handful of newer residents getting organized to protect property values, I didn't think much of it. My land predated the HOA, and so did my deed. No covenants, no restrictions, just me, the cabin, and a lake that had seen more peace than conflict. That's when Karen moved in. She wasn't immediately a problem. She was the type who waved too long and asked questions you didn't have time to answer. Harmless enough at first. I'd see her marching up and down the gravel road in high-vis vests, clipboard in hand, peering at yards like they were crime scenes. Some folks liked her. Others tolerated her. I mostly ignored her. I work in federal investigations, and I've been trained to detect fraud, lies, and manipulation. But off-duty, I don't go looking for it. I like to believe people aren't stupid enough to mess with someone who minds his business. Karen, it turns out, had never learned that lesson. I kept my job low-key. Most folks just thought I worked for the government in some admin role. That's what I wanted. When I went up to the cabin, I left my badge in the drawer and wore flannel like everyone else. It was my reset. I fished. I chopped wood. I tinkered in the shed. I had neighbors who nodded instead of waved and dogs who barked like alarms, but never bit. It was exactly what I needed. Then came the notes. It started with a notice from the HOA, stuffed into my fence gate, folded like a parking ticket. Non-compliant fencing, it read. I ignored it. The fence had been there 20 years. Then came the follow-up, unregistered outdoor structure. That structure? My outhouse. Original to the cabin, sealed, functional, and completely legal under the county code. I sent a simple response. This property does not fall under your jurisdiction. Respectfully, do not contact me again. But of course, Karen couldn't help herself. She saw non-compliance as a challenge, and challenges had to be corrected. She began sniffing around more aggressively, asking neighbors what I did, whether the cabin was occupied full-time, whether I was paying fair share, HOA dues. I wasn't. I didn't have to. I kept my cool. Let her flap her wings. I dealt with cartel money launderers, Ponzi schemers, and medical fraud rings. Karen didn't even make my radar until the mail came. One crisp October afternoon, I stopped by the cabin to check mail and prep the place for winter. I had just started hauling firewood when I opened a federal letter, one meant for someone else, but sent to my cabin's address. It wasn't a mistake. The name on the envelope wasn't mine, but the address was. And it wasn't junk mail, it was tax-related. Red flag. I requested more from the post office. Turns out, multiple filings, tax documents, loan inquiries, even state assistance forms have been submitted using my cabin's address. That's when the switch flipped. My retreat, my sanctuary, was being used in a fraud scheme. And I had a pretty good idea who might be behind it. I pulled the cabin's visitor camera footage, reviewed the logs. A week prior, someone had walked up to the porch, looked around, snapped a picture of the mailbox, and walked away. The shape? The hair? The clipboard? Karen. Still, I didn't jump to conclusions. You don't get to my position by assuming guilt. I needed more than suspicion. I needed proof. And if she had crossed that line, she wasn't just messing with a neighbor. She was messing with a federal agent, and she had no idea what was coming. The first sign that something was wrong came wrapped in an official-looking envelope from the IRS. At first, the protagonist assumed it was a routine notice, maybe a tax document related to his city residence or a delay in filing. But when he opened it, a wave of confusion washed over him. The address listed wasn't his primary home. It was the address of his lake cabin, the one he used sparingly, mostly for weekend escapes and quiet reflection. It wasn't just a misdelivery. It was a form tied to income reported under his name at that location, income he hadn't earned, signed with a digital signature he didn't recognize. Something wasn't right. He sat at the kitchen table of the cabin, the forest breeze brushing past the open window, and began reading each line. The form listed fictitious employment, obscure write-offs, and income tied to a landscaping business, one he had no connection to. But what caught his eye was the number of dependents claimed and a tax refund that had already been processed. He leaned back in his chair, every instinct from his agency training kicking in. As a federal investigator, the signs were clear. This wasn't just a clerical error. Someone was using his lake cabin address to commit fraud. And someone local. Rather than alert anyone immediately, he did what professionals in his line of work always do. He documented. He pulled his laptop, ran a few queries, and matched the tax documents against public filings. He saw that his cabin's address had been associated with multiple suspicious filings over the last 2 years. The same address, same method, different names, all circling one entity, a small, registered landscaping company recently linked to a new LLC, one with Karen's name on the paperwork. At that moment, everything changed. Until now, Karen had been an irritant. The kind of HOA president who left passive-aggressive notes about wind chimes and lawn decor. But this was something darker. It wasn't about power trips or petty rules. It was financial fraud, federal level. He reviewed camera footage from his driveway and saw something interesting. A delivery had been dropped off while he was away on a work trip, addressed to a person he didn't know. The package was later picked up by Karen herself. She didn't even look suspicious. She acted like it was hers. He printed the screenshots and added them to a manila folder. No one knew yet that this cabin belonged to someone who could bring serious weight down on a federal case. And for now, he intended to keep it that way. Then came the next twist. Karen showed up unannounced the following day. He heard her heels crunching the gravel before he saw her. She stood at the edge of his property, arms crossed, a clipboard in one hand, HOA logo printed on the back of her shirt like she was leading a field inspection. "We need to talk about some recent structure violations," she said curtly, pointing toward the shed he'd recently repainted. "Your cabin has some unresolved compliance issues." He looked at her, keeping his voice calm. "I'm not under HOA jurisdiction. You know that." Karen waved a hand dismissively. "Proximity ordinances apply now. We're updating bylaws. You'll be receiving formal notice." But her eyes weren't on the cabin. They were scanning the area, as if checking to make sure nothing had changed since the last time she was here. That's when it clicked. She hadn't just been trespassing for enforcement. She'd been here, using the address, possibly accessing mail, maybe even coordinating deliveries under the radar. "I'd recommend keeping everything in compliance," she said, her voice laced with threat. "We don't want any more attention brought to the area." Too late, he thought. The attention was already coming, just not the kind she was expecting. He watched her walk away, smirking. Then he turned and locked the door behind him. In that moment, the stakes were no longer about property lines or HOA letters. Karen had dragged herself across a federal line, one that no amount of neighborhood gossip or procedural bluster could protect her from. He picked up the manila folder, placed it into a secure travel bag, and made a call. Not to a lawyer, but to someone in his department. Quietly, the investigation had begun. And Karen? She had no idea the next door she'd be knocking on might have a badge behind it. After Karen's smug little visit, the protagonist stood at the window for a while, letting her image fade into the tree-lined horizon. The audacity, walking onto his land, accusing him of violations, while secretly using his address to commit tax fraud. But now it wasn't just suspicion. It was time for confirmation. He powered up his secure laptop, one he used for agency work, not general browsing. As a federal agent, he had access to data tools that most people couldn't dream of. His cabin, his sanctuary, had just been turned into a crime scene, and he wasn't going to let it slide. He started with a simple data check: Karen's full name, property ownership, previous addresses. As he suspected, she didn't just own the home she lived in now. She'd cycled through several properties over the last decade, but what stood out was the number of temporary addresses listed as current over the past 2 years. There were 5. One of them was his cabin. He ran the addresses through federal filing databases. Sure enough, 2 tax returns in the last 2 years had used his cabin as a filing address. Neither was under her name, but both had direct deposits that routed back to an account tied to an LLC she owned. He leaned forward, tapping the screen. This wasn't just petty fraud, this was layered, intentional, structured. Next, he pulled credit activity reports tied to the address. Several credit card applications, 1 vehicle registration, and a benefits claim for state assistance, all fraudulently listing his address as a primary residence. It was a network, a ring, and it all orbited around one person who thought no one would check because no one knew who he really was. But he wasn't just another homeowner. He was a federal investigator trained to unravel complex fraud networks, and Karen had just handed him the first thread to pull. He opened a digital case file and began building a timeline. Year 1. First false tax filing using his cabin address. Month 3. Delivery logs show packages arriving addressed to aliases. Year 2. Business entity registered using the same address. Last week, Karen picked up mail from the cabin's porch in plain view of a camera. He called an internal contact, a senior legal advisor within his agency. Preliminary or official, the voice asked. Let's start with internal. If this goes where I think it's going, I'll elevate. He emailed the documents, redacted for now, and tagged them for internal review. Within 20 minutes, the reply came back. Confirm full ownership of property. Get a sworn affidavit. We'll fast-track the fraud trigger. She's done this before. 2 open cases, 1 pending in another state. You just might be the nail in the coffin. That was the final click. She wasn't just dabbling. Karen was running a pattern, hopping addresses, building false tax filings, and leveraging HOA power as a cover for identity-based fraud. And worst of all, she chose the wrong cabin this time. He sat back in his chair and smiled, not out of joy, but with the calm satisfaction of someone watching a puzzle fall into place. The next morning, he went to the local notary and had a sworn affidavit notarized confirming he'd never granted Karen, or anyone, permission to use his address. Then he logged a notice with the county recorder's office affirming sole ownership and residency use, legally freezing any activity against the property until the fraud case cleared. Karen would get the notice soon, and she'd know something had shifted, but she had no idea just how deep it ran. The quiet hum of a government-issued SUV broke the stillness of the neighborhood. It was a cloudless morning, the kind that made the lake shimmer and the birds sing, a perfect backdrop for a reckoning. Karen stepped on her front porch, mail in one hand, phone in the other. She was mid-scroll when the 2 agents stepped out of the vehicle, crisp suits, polished badges clipped cleanly to their jackets. Karen Mitchell, the taller one asked, voice steady and unmistakably official. She blinked, confused. Yes, we're with the Office of the Inspector General. We'd like to speak to you about a case involving federal address fraud and tax misuse. A pause. Her lips parted like she might laugh, some Karen-style deflection. But then she caught sight of the folder in the agent's hand. It bore her name, and his, the man she thought she could intimidate with HOA fines and a smug walk across his cabin porch. Her composure cracked just slightly. Is this about the cabin? She asked, trying to feign concern. We'll discuss the details inside. But before she could usher them in, a 3rd vehicle pulled up, this time unmarked. A local officer stepped out, joining the scene. The moment had drawn attention. Neighbors peeked through blinds. One man walking his dog stopped mid-step and pretended to tie his shoe for a full 5 minutes. The agents didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. when Karen began to protest. I thought it was abandoned. They calmly countered with time-stamped images, tax documents, credit fraud, and even GPS tag package delivery records. You've been receiving mail at this address, yes? The agent asked, holding up a photo of her picking up mail from the cabin's porch. Her smile vanished. I was just making sure the area was safe, she stammered. For who? The second agent asked. Your LLC? Or the false dependent listed in your Schedule C form? A flicker of panic passed over her face. She tried again. This is all a misunderstanding. I'm sure I can clear it up. But it was too late. The federal process had begun. Across the street, a cluster of HOA board members had begun gathering, some confused, others grim. One of them, the treasurer, looked visibly shaken. The vice president made a quiet retreat into their house, phone glued to ear. A neighbor who had once backed Karen's enforcement letters now stood slack-jawed, watching as she was asked to step into the vehicle. Not in handcuffs, not yet, but not freely either. A federal detainment for questioning. And that was more than enough to destroy the illusion of control. Word spread fast. By lunch, the neighborhood group chat was in meltdown mode. Someone posted a clip, grainy phone footage of Karen being guided into the car with a manila envelope in hand. The caption? So about that HOA, Queen Energy. Eyes. Others chimed in. Is this why she was so obsessed with mailbox codes? Did she really use someone else's address for taxes? Wait, the cabin guy? I thought he was just quiet, not federal agent quiet. By sundown, Karen's name had been removed from the HOA contact directory. The board issued a vague statement. We are aware of recent developments involving one of our members. The HOA does not condone illegal behavior and is cooperating with all inquiries. The protagonist read it while sipping tea from his back deck, dog curled up beside him. He didn't need to respond. The facts were doing all the talking. That evening, a neighbor knocked on his cabin door. A retired teacher from the far end of the neighborhood, someone who'd once forwarded a complaint about unregistered driveway activity. She stood sheepishly with a plate of brownies. I didn't know what she was doing. Just wanted to say thanks for setting things right. And if you ever need a witness. He smiled and accepted the plate. Appreciated, he said. I just protect what's mine, the legal way. The fallout wasn't over yet. Karen would face a formal hearing, likely charges depending on how deep the investigation ran. The IRS, the State Fraud Division, and possibly even a civil suit from the agency. But for the first time, the neighborhood knew who they were really living next to. Not a recluse, not a troublemaker, but a man who played the long game and always had the law on his side. The lake was still again. A few leaves drifted across the water, the morning sun glinting off its glassy surface. The air, once thick with tension and gossip, had settled into something more respectful, more careful. Karen was gone. No big farewell, no announcement, just a quiet message posted in the HOA bulletin. Effective immediately, Karen Mitchell has stepped down from her position on the board. We wish her well. But everyone knew, was going to involve a long legal process, federal paperwork, and possibly court proceedings. The HOA, once emboldened by Karen's bluster, was now humbled by what she tried to get away with, and who she'd tried to cross. The protagonist didn't gloat. He never mentioned the investigation at the local meetings, never corrected the wild speculations that swirled for weeks. He didn't need to. The truth had done its work. A few neighbors who once kept their distance now gave polite waves when they passed his driveway. A couple stopped to chat when they saw him walking his dog, offering not-so-subtle gratitude without ever using the word sorry. Hey, just wanted to say it's good to have someone around who keeps things straight, one said, handing over a local newspaper clipping with Karen's name buried in a small report about the federal probe. The HOA quietly held a special session. They passed a motion requiring dual authorization for any policy involving personal data or residential complaints. They also created a new committee, this time focused on ethics and boundary policies. Notably, no one nominated themselves to lead it. As for the cabin, life returned to what it always had been. Simple, peaceful, protected. Only now, there were subtle upgrades. A reinforced mailbox with tamper-proof locks. A new digital monitoring system. A folder of legal documents scanned and stored, ready in case anyone ever questioned ownership again. But most importantly, a deeper stillness inside the protagonist himself. He didn't just defend property, he defended legacy. He defended the right to live honestly without interference, and reminded everyone that quiet doesn't mean weak. That just because someone isn't loud doesn't mean they don't hold the power to change the entire neighborhood with one badge, one deed, and a well-documented truth. He stepped out onto the porch one evening as the sun dipped below the lake, his dog stretching beside him. The shed door creaked gently in the wind. The one Karen once said looked out of place. Now it stood untouched. A neighbor's kid rode by on a bike, glanced up, and gave a shy wave. The protagonist nodded back. No fanfare, no revenge speeches, just peace. Earned, not enforced. And for the first time in months, it truly felt like home again. If someone thinks they can use your name, your home, or your address to commit fraud, don't panic, just do what I did. Stay quiet, stay focused, and most of all, stay legal. You don't need to shout when you have the receipts. You don't need to argue when your badge says federal and your case file builds itself. You don't need to threaten, not when the law already wrote the ending and all you had to do was turn the page. Because when someone like Karen thinks she can falsify your address, reroute your mail, or file government documents in your name, she's not just stepping over a line. She's diving headfirst into a jurisdiction she doesn't understand. And when she finds out too late that the cabin she tried to steal credit from belongs to someone trained to track her kind, well, let's just say the look on her face said it all. The truth is, fraud isn't complicated. It's usually just arrogance with a form and a pen. But accountability? That's where it gets real. So the next time someone knocks on your door, try to rewrite your story. Make sure they know who lives there. And if you carry the badge, they're already caught.